All right, Shannon, we are live.
All right, thank you, Carol Ann. Welcome to tonight's virtual event featuring Lewis Martini Winery. My name is Shannon, and I'm a part of the New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlet social team. We have a super special event for you tonight as part of our 90 Days Around the World promotion. So you've joined us various nights. For the last few months, we've taken you all over the world to different wineries and distilleries, and we've met some of the industry's biggest brand names. Tonight, we find ourselves in St. Helena, California. I am joined by a few experts tonight. We have Michael Eddy. He is the Director of Winemaking at Lewis Martini Winery. We also have Lisa Goslin from our New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlets Wines marketing team. Michael has a really exciting presentation to share with us tonight, and I'm here to share any questions with him that you may have throughout the event. So whether you're joining us on Zoom or on Facebook, please be sure to leave your comments in the comment section. Lisa's going to be here to answer any questions that you may have regarding inventory or store availability in any of our liquor and wine outlets. So be sure to leave your questions for her as well, and we'll make sure that they get answered for you. So for those of you that have pre-registered tonight, we're going to be giving away some really cool prizes. We have a set of 4 Louis Martini engraved Rydell Cabernet wine glasses. We also have a Patagonia Louis Martini branded vest. So we're going to be asking 2 trivia questions. So make sure that you're listening very closely to Michael's presentation tonight so that you know the answers. Winners will be announced immediately and then contacted via email after the fact. So make sure to take a look in your inboxes over the next few days for those communications. And for those of you that have purchased your bottles of wine ahead of tonight's event, go you. But you can go ahead and start opening those now, because Michael's going to start off with some history and an introduction into the brand, and then we'll be jumping right into the tasting portion after that. So without further ado, Michael, I'll pass it off to you to get started. What can you tell us about Louis Martini wines?
Well, thank you very much, Shannon. And thank you everybody for joining this afternoon for me, but evening for you. I'm really excited to talk to you all, but as Shannon mentioned, feel free to open the wines. If you want to start tasting them, that's great. I'm going to talk for a little bit and then we'll kind of dive into each of the wines specifically in a little more depth. I won't say I never have gotten a little perverse joy out of making a group of people stare at a wine glass with wine in it and not taste it. And people are usually so polite, they sit there and they wait. But do feel free to go at it and start tasting the wines if you wish. At least make sure they're open. And I might give you some tips when we get to the wines also on how to observe different aspects of the wine. I also will say, Shannon mentioned, send your questions through. I've said for many years that I think wine makes a far better conversation than it does a lecture. So while I certainly will be doing a lot of talking, I am here for you guys. And if you have questions, whether it be about the Martini wine specifically or about wine in general, general wine knowledge, serving, etc., I'm happy to answer those. So send in your questions and try to give me more than I can answer in an hour. And that'll be the challenge for you. So I'm going to switch real quick to a presentation here because visuals do wonders, and kind of take you through a little history. I've told the story of Martini many times, but it is a story that doesn't get old, honestly, to tell, because I do think it is one of those great examples of the American dream. And while I would submit that we have a lot of work to do to make the American dream more accessible to more people, as something that we aspire to as a country, I think it's really cool to see these stories of people who have pursued their passions and had great success. And Louis Martini is certainly one of those. Louis grew up in Genoa, Italy, and his father was a fisherman who left when Louis was pretty young, left Italy and came over to San Francisco Bay Area in California, actually just about an hour south of where I am, to pursue this fishing. And at some point, he eventually called for his son to come over, as was common in those days. This was pre-1900, by the way. Called for his son to come over and help him. And so young Louis, at, we believe, the age of 13 years old, made the trek by himself. So took a ship across the Atlantic, came through Ellis Island, took rail cars all the way across the United States to San Francisco, which is quite a journey. And to me, it's hard to imagine these days a person at that age making that kind of trek on their own, but ultimately joined his father and helped him out with fishing. And in San Francisco, there is still a community called North Beach, which is essentially Little Italy. So it's what was established as an Italian-American community there. And as was common in a lot of communities, barter was a big part of what made the community function and the economics there. And so they would trade fish for, to the butcher for meat, to the baker for bread, et cetera. And they would often have leftover fish. And these are the days when refrigeration was not as capable and as common. And so when they had leftover fish, they would make a stew or soup that you may know of called cioppino. Cioppino actually originated, while it is Italian in heritage and feel, it actually originated in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a tomato-based stew with mixed seafood in it. And so they would make this cioppino and they would put this out as a trading item. And as it so happened, at one point, a grape grower dropped off some wine grapes and traded it for some cioppino. Well, Louis M. Martini thought he'd try his hand at winemaking. He certainly was a big part of his culture back in Italy. And the word is, we don't know for sure, that was the first batch of Martini vinegar that was ever made, because I can tell you that the first batch of wine I made at home was not that great. It takes some technical know-how to do it well, but it was just enough to really ignite that passion and made young Louis realize that perhaps he didn't want to pursue his father's career. Perhaps he didn't want to stay in fishing, and really caught the bug for this winemaking thing. Eventually, he went back to Italy to study more about winemaking, as his English was at that point not really great, was a star student, and ended up coming back to California, made wine in a number of locations throughout the state, but ultimately settled in St. Helena, California, which is almost smack dab in the middle of Napa Valley, which I'm sure you all have heard of. But keep in mind, at this point, the Napa Valley was not world famous for wine. It was actually mixed agricultural lands. And it turns out that over time, it developed into this world-renowned wine area. But at the time, it had all sorts of agriculture: prunes, row crops, walnuts, etc. But he planted himself in the middle of Napa Valley. And you could suggest that that was a pretty lucky move. What I observe about the stories I've heard about Louis M. is that he had a very unique combination of vision and luck, being at the right time at the right place, but also being able to see the potential. And so he built his winery in St. Helena in 1933, which is right as Prohibition was coming to a close. And you can see here a picture of him next to his original winery, in which we are still housed. But Louis M. built a really great business and ultimately passed it on to his son, Louis P. Martini. Now, these were very, very different gentlemen. Here you see a picture of Louis M. with his son, Louis P. Louis M. was kind of a scrappy, opportunistic guy, very, very entrepreneurial. You can see the winery up to the top right here. I don't know the actual year that this was taken, but this is a pretty old photo. Because there are now a number of other buildings on the property, but that is the original shell of the original winery, which we'll get to a little bit more in a minute. But Louis P. continued the success of his father, and in fact, contributed a lot of technical innovations to the wine industry, including, if you've ever been to wine country, we use these large fans to help prevent frost damage to the vines. The Martini family also was some of the first to use cooled fermentations. So back in the day, you couldn't make a tank very big because it would get so hot from the fermentation that it would actually damage the wine quality. And so being able to cool a fermentation and preserve a lot of those fresh fruit flavors was a huge, huge technological advantage to winemaking. And the family pioneered that. And in addition to making wines from Napa Valley, they really ventured out. And again, remember that I said in these early days, Napa Valley wasn't a label that you put on a wine. It was on bottles of wine, but it was not the powerful, recognized wine region that it is today. And so the family ventured out and just really looked for great vineyards. And in fact, they bought what is now one of the most famous vineyards in California called Monte Rosso, which is actually in Sonoma County. Louis M. bought that vineyard in 1938, just 5 years after he built his winery. And continues to be a very, very famous vineyard, which we own and farm and make some vineyard designates, wines specifically from that vineyard. But they ventured into Lake County, into Russian River, which is also in Sonoma County, down into the Central Coast over the years. And Louis P. eventually passed the reins on to his son, Mike Martini. I don't have a picture of Mike here, but Mike was the third and final generation of Martini family winemakers. And when I took over, I became the first winemaker without the last name Martini. But I was very fortunate in that I got to spend 10 years with Mike Martini, really learning about the family's history, the portfolio, the wines that they had made, the styles. And I think it's important to mention style because while I believe that our portfolio as a whole demonstrates a specific fingerprint that is unique to us and is a nod to our heritage, I am in no way trying to make the exact same wines that Louis M. or Louis P. made. We continue to evolve and move in a new direction. But the history for me is really a fantastic inspiration for what I do on a daily basis. It connects me to a story, gives more meaning to what I do. And it's also a source of inspiration. In fact, our flagship pinnacle Napa Valley Cabernet is called Lot 1. And that is a nod to what Louis P. did. He started bottling up these special selections of Lot 3, Lot 7, because one of the things as a winemaker that is painful to do is you make these very unique wines and then you blend them all together and they are never seen or tasted ever again and nobody gets to experience them. So he started bottling up these special lots, and so we created our flagship program Lot 1 in homage to kind of some of the things that he had done. And so that kind of brings me to me. I've worked at a handful of wineries across the north coast of California primarily, but really started working with Mike Martini on specifically assisting him with the first wine that we're going to taste, the Sonoma County Cabernet, and spent 10 years, really started taking more ownership and authority over the wines in around 2013. And then Mike officially retired in early 2015. But another one of the great things about being connected to this history is that you have these physical legacies. And one of those is the winery. I'm going to scroll back real quick because this is the original winery that Louis M. built. However, we underwent major renovations over the course of more than a decade, at least from conception all the way through to finished execution, to renovate this winery. And we think it is kind of the final touch on really showcasing an outstanding portfolio of wines that is exciting in its own right, but also demonstrates our history and heritage. And so this is that winery. The original 1933 building and shell is still there, but we hired Howard Backen, who you may know is a fairly well-known architect, to really give it a new look and feel, but still pay respect to that kind of rustic traditional feel. The building, you can see on the bottom right here, the sign has these terracotta tiles, and there are two walls of those terracotta tiles that made up, they're actually hollow core terracotta tiles, I would say about 3 inches wide or thick. And those still form the foundation of the winery. In addition, we've really expanded our experience at the winery. So to go along with this beautiful space that we've created, we are now, we hired shortly before we opened the renovated winery in 19, we hired a chef, state chef, Jeff Russell, who was with Charlie Palmer. You may know of Charlie Palmer for, I believe, 10 years, worked out on the East Coast, as well as in Napa. And he has really been a fantastic experience for me because while I knew when he came on that he would do some interesting things to pair with the wines, what I didn't really anticipate was seeing how he could accentuate or de-emphasize different elements of the wines with his food and wine pairings. So he does some very, very exciting things. And when I go back to my image, you will see that I have a virtual background, which is Martini Park. We have an outdoor area with cabanas, with outdoor pizza ovens, and we can do tastings out there. You can rent cabanas. We have several different types of wine and food pairing experiences that Chef Russell puts together. So it really is a full encompassing experience, and has been very, very exciting to work with him and again, see how he interprets the wine through the foods that he pairs with them. So that brings us to today, but I also want really quickly, because when we dive into the wines here, geography is important. You have probably heard that the vineyard is what really makes a wine. I would say it's not the most important. We often forget one of the most critical variables with how a wine tastes, and that is actually the grape variety. Grape variety across the whole wine world is probably the most critical variable that goes into making a wine taste the way it does. But vineyards are very, very critical, and where those vineyards are, how they're farmed, the soils, the climate, etc. And so I just want to gauge us really on a macro level about climate in both Napa Valley, and then to the west of Napa Valley here you see part of Sonoma County, and you can see Monte Rosso Vineyard, which I referenced. But at the south end, or the bottom of the page, you can see San Pablo Bay. That's part of the San Francisco Bay complex. And the ocean brings in a dramatic cooling effect to the wine growing regions of Northern California. And in Napa Valley, that comes through the southern end here. You see the town of Vallejo. The cool air moves up the valley and then retreats during the day. And so we can kind of simplify Napa Valley a little bit in the sense that from a climate standpoint, we can generalize and say that in the Oak Knoll district, which you see almost dead center of the page, it is going to be much cooler than St. Helena, where our winery is, or Calistoga, which is the very, very furthest reach north of Napa Valley. And in addition, we can kind of generalize about soil types in the sense that the Napa Valley, or the Napa River, runs right down Napa Valley. And as you approach the river, if you're next to the river, what you tend to see is fairly rich soils, heavier soils that promote greater vine growth. And that will have a certain effect on the style of wine that is grown there. And as you move out from the river, either east or west, up into the benchlands, and then ultimately up into the mountains, you tend to get thinner and thinner soils, which really mitigate or reduce the vigor of the vine, reduce the crop level, and produce very different styles of wine. So just a generality, but that's the one thing I want you to remember most is climate. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the map showing all of Sonoma County, but if you look up to the top left there, you can see Knights Valley. And if we continue to move northwest of that, we would move into Alexander Valley, which is a wine that we're going to be tasting as well. And to the west of Alexander Valley would be Dry Creek Valley. And those are two important regions when we're going to talk about the Sonoma County Cabernet. So I may pull this back up if we get questions about vineyards. I will point out some of our vineyards. They're marked in red here. We won't talk too much about Monte Rosso today, but when we get to the Napa Valley Cab, our final wine, you see vineyards named Stagecoach, Sage Canyon, Cypress Ranch, and Sun Lake. You'll notice that those aren't in the valley floor proper. They're actually up in the hills. There's an elevated valley called Childs Valley, which maybe you can read depending upon how big your device screen is. And then as we move up to Sun Lake and Cypress, we get into what's called Pope Valley. So they technically are valleys. We wouldn't call those areas hillsides, but they are at elevation. So they are more mountain-like in the character of wines that they produce. And Shannon, I don't know if we've had any questions on anything so far.
Yeah, actually, this is a perfect segue. Tracy was curious about how many acres you have in vineyards as of today.
I don't have a precise number, but it is many hundreds. You can barely see a ranch up to the top left there called Borelli Creek, which is a very important ranch to the Sonoma County Cabernet that we make. Not all of the fruit off of that ranch goes into this wine. However, I want to say that's 800 acres alone. Monte Rosso is a kind of medium-sized ranch, and it is 300 and something acres planted. I believe the whole property is a little over 500. So that's kind of a sense of scale. It's many hundreds. Stagecoach, which some of you may know, is actually a very famous It's probably one of the most famous, very modern vineyards. We just acquired several years ago, and we still sell quite a bit of the fruit off that ranch. It is quite large. It is many hundreds of acres. It is really a unique property. It's not super relevant to the wines we're tasting today, but we actually are going to be releasing a Stagecoach Vineyard specific wine here next year, which is very, very exciting for me. And Stagecoach has been one of the most consistent contributors to the blend for our Lot 1 Cabernet that I mentioned is our kind of flagship Napa Cab.
This might be something that you cover during the tasting notes portion, but someone on Facebook was actually curious about how those growing conditions impact the taste of the wines.
We can, but I'll give it in general terms first of all. So typically speaking, in a cooler area with any grape variety, what you're going to do is you're going to tend to have higher acidity in that fruit. The synthesis of acid in the berries is promoted by cooler temperatures. You will tend to get a little bit more of the greener herbal notes. So when we talk about Cabernet, we'll talk about the fruit components, but then they're also, in terms of flavor and aroma, one of the things that is characteristic of Cabernet Sauvignon is that it has this herbal, all the way to vegetal. Vegetal tends to be undesirable to most people, like bell pepper, but this kind of culinary herbs or medicinal herb, kind of like a tincture, is very, very typical of Cabernet, and that tends to be more accentuated in cooler areas. In addition, when you have warmer temperatures, particularly leading up to harvest and during the ripening period, you can develop riper characters, meaning, and so we conceptualize fruit character in a wine as existing across the spectrum. On the far end of less ripe, we would say underripe fruit. So if you have a cherry, right, and it's really tart, you know that flavor. Or maybe I don't know, do you guys have like blackberries or wild berries, brambles? You have blueberries, huh? Blackberries really.
Blackberries. We do have some blackberries and raspberries too, though.
Okay. So if you've ever picked blackberries, you know, you get those ones that are really tart. They're recognizable as a blackberry, but they're really underripe. And then they move through this phase of kind of that's ripe flavor. And then to me, the ideal, what I love for a blackberry is you go to pick it and it actually falls off in your hand. And you get this ripeness that is almost like it's just about to be jam or pie. It's not quite there, but it's really ripe. And then we move into what we would call cooked fruit, or it would be pie or jam or compote. And then ultimately you can get dried fruit characters as well if you get a lot of dehydration in the grapes. And so that's kind of how we conceptualize it. And then warmer areas, you're going to get more, it's going to be easier for you to drive towards that really ripe, maybe even jammy character. Does that answer it? I think it does.
Yeah, I think that was great.
Okay.
All right. So let me see.
So with that, go ahead.
Did have another question from someone on Facebook regarding getting out there to California, and if you guys are currently open for tours or any type of events currently.
Ooh, that's a great question. Obviously, COVID-19 has changed that a lot. And honestly, over the last couple of weeks, I haven't kept up because I've been on vacation. We were, for a long time, open outdoors exclusively and by reservation. So you had to call in it. You couldn't walk in. And we are, I believe, still doing curbside pickup if you want to buy wines. However, things are changing quickly right now, so I don't want to say for sure. But we have, it has been one of the advantages of having our outdoor space in the park, which this time of year is obviously a little less attractive. But on a nice winter day in Northern California, actually can be quite enjoyable as long as you're wearing a sweater. And so that's in real flux, but we have tried to maintain open, an open state, but obviously being very mindful about the health and safety of both our guests and our staff. So mask wearing, all of that good stuff. But it's changing quickly. So good question though. I should have double checked on that. I apologize.
No worries. I'm sure everyone can find those details on your website too.
Yes. Yep. Or call. Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so we have a few more questions before you get into the wine portion or tasting portion, I should say. So In regards to the aging process, is there a typical recommended period of time that you would recommend someone age at home any of your bottles?
Great question. One I get it often. So we're talking about bottle age. So there's aging that we do in the winery, which I'll touch on when we get to the wines. In terms of bottle age, it really is a very personal preference. When I release the wines, I intend for them to be enjoyable. I won't release them until they're ready to drink. However, wines change throughout aging in the bottle. I will say if you are interested in aging in the bottle, storage conditions are very critical. You do want to keep it as close to 60 degrees, 58 degrees as possible. If you're up at 70 plus degrees, I wouldn't recommend you age a wine for years, and preferably out of direct light as well. But if you do have proper storage conditions, wines can undergo some very interesting changes. I'll describe them to you, but I'll be honest, the best way to experience that is to buy half a case of a wine, lay it down, and taste it once a year, and reflect on how it changes. But in general, young wines tend to have a lot of intensity. And frankly, most wine drinkers, especially in the United States these days, are used to that, and that's what they enjoy. They enjoy a wine with a lot of intensity. They also will have a lot of mouthfeel, which means, and we'll get into that, but tannin, the coarseness or that dryness that you have in the mouth, they will have more of that. As they age in the bottle, they will lose intensity. However, they will pick up complexity. So they'll develop more layers and more interest. They will also soften in terms of mouthfeel. I like to talk in analogies, and the analogy that I always use, and I apologize if you're a vegetarian, I have been a vegetarian several times in my life, but if you take a really great steak, right? Let's take a Wagyu dry aged New York strip. All of us who eat beef are going to be able to agree probably that that's a really nice steak. However, some of you are going to want it cooked to medium. I'm going to want it medium rare, and I'm right, by the way. But that is a different way to experience what we both agree is a fantastic piece of meat. Same thing with aging wine in the bottle. There isn't an optimal necessarily. There may be an optimal for you and your preferences, but it really boils down to personal preference. And honestly, a lot of people, when they taste wines that have been aged in the bottle for, say, 2 decades, 3 decades, the first time they experience that, they're pretty surprised and frankly, often a little bit disappointed. It's not what they expect. But it can be a lot of fun really to track those wines over time and learn for yourself how they change. We can go back to this in each of these wines, but I have had the Sonoma County is our most broadly distributed, largest volume, very much intended for immediate pleasure. But I can tell you that it's been a little while since we've done a full vertical of this wine, meaning tasting all the vintages made. But I can tell you 10, 15 years, that wine holds up beautifully. So even that wine has the potential to age and still be interesting and enjoyable. But again, it may not be when you get the most pleasure from it.
Great. All right, one more, and then we'll kick off tasting.
Okay.
So David on our Zoom chat is curious if all of your wines are estate grown or if you import any of your grapes.
I wouldn't say import. That's not quite the right word. Estate grown has a very, very specific legal definition. So for instance, the Sonoma County Cabernet, because our winery is actually in Napa, it is impossible for us to call that estate produced and bottled. There are very specific legal regulations. The wine has to be grown in the area that the wine is labeled. So for instance, it has to be made at a winery in the area where the wine is grown. So we could not legally call the Sonoma County estate. I think maybe the spirit of the question is, do we grow all of our own fruit? And the answer is no, we grow a huge percentage of it. But in fact, we buy fruit from outside growers as well. We actually partner with them and tell them how we'd like the grapes farmed. But one of the challenges, particularly in Napa Valley, is not just growing the grapes and making the wine, but it's actually finding really great pieces of property, because the really good pieces of property are highly coveted and don't come up for sale very often. So it's very common to go out and buy fruit from growers who have those properties. And in fact, our Lot 1 Cabernet, our flagship, on average is probably 80 to 90% fruit from outside growers. So there's not necessarily a limitation to quality by not growing your own grapes. It does take a very, very important relationship, and relationships are really critical in a lot of businesses, but I can tell you that in farming, they're very, very important. Okay, move on to tasting.
Let's do it. Should we interject with one of our trivia questions?
Go for it. Yes.
All right. So the first trivia question we have is going to be for the 4 Rydell Cabernet wine glasses. We're going to be picking one of the correct answers at random. We have a number in our heads. So the first question is, Louis Martini first came over to the U.S. from Italy at what age? All right, so we've got the answers rolling in.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So a lot of correct answers. So the correct answer is in fact 13. I don't see one incorrect answer here. The winner of that for tonight, 3, 4, 5 is Caitlin Sweeney. So our lucky winner was number 5, the 5th correct answer for that trivia question. So congratulations, Caitlin. I'll be in contact with you to get you those nice new Cabernet glasses.
Great,
And
congratulations.
Speaking of drinking glasses, actually, Michael, do you have a preference on how you like to drink your wine?
How so? You mean glassware wise?
Yeah, glass preference.
It's one of those things that I'm not as disciplined about as I should be. I will tell you that it depends on the experience a lot for me. So I can tell you that Riedel does some special educational tastings with their line of glassware. And for those of you who don't know Riedel very well, they actually have variety specific glasses that are crafted to bring out the best in specific varieties or styles of wine. And I had always heard for years that doing this tasting of their glassware next to each other was kind of mind blowing. And I'll be honest, I kind of blew it off. I knew it probably made a difference, but I thought, well, the shape of the glass probably makes a difference in perception of aroma, but it's still going to taste pretty much the same. Well, when we partnered with Riedel to make these glasses, and you probably can't see my glass because I have a virtual background, but the glasses they were giving away today are exclusive to us, designed by Riedel. And they came over and we did a whole workshop with them to determine the stem that would show off our Napa Valley Cabernet best. And Mr. Riedel brought, I want to say, a dozen plus different prototypes of glassware that he didn't sell on the open market. And we all tasted and evaluated and scored and settled on this glass. I was blown away at how different the wines tasted. It really does make a very big difference. And not as I suspected, just in aroma. It definitely affected the aroma. But something about the shape of the glass directs the flow of the wine across your palate that actually makes your perception of flavor and mouthfeel and acidity and all of that stuff different between the different stems. However, for me, it also is a matter of the vibe. So if I have a very special wine and I'm having a guest over for a meal to open up a wine that I really want to showcase, I'm absolutely going to think about the stem. But if I'm having pizza and just drinking an enjoyable wine casually, I'll even use a bistro glass. So I'm not even talking like the stemless wine glass. I'm talking like a chunky bistro glass. To me, it's part of the vibe. I want something more casual. I'm not thinking about that wine that much. I'm just enjoying it with some casual food. So it really is very dependent for me on the scenario.
I would tend to agree myself.
Great. All right. So let's move into these wines. We're going to taste 3 wines, all Cabernet Sauvignon. And I think that's where we should start the discussion. We currently make 9 different Cabernet Sauvignons. I mentioned we're going to be releasing a new one next year. And that's a lot of different cabs. So why do you make different cabs? Well, there are a few reasons. One obviously is to offer different prices for different people and different occasions, but clearly it's also to showcase different styles. And style of wine can be influenced by a number of things. I mentioned that variety is important, but here we're talking specifically about Cabernet Sauvignon. I mentioned that where the grapes are grown is important, and we have some differences in where these grapes are grown. But in addition, what we do in the winery has an impact on the style of the wine as well. And so I'm going to talk about both the vineyards and the crafting of the wine as we go through these. I will say also, hopefully you have your wines open. If you happen to have the luxury of 3 of the same glasses, you might pour all 3 of these in 3 glasses and go back and forth. Presumably you're here because you like to learn about wine. And I think one of the easiest ways to learn is to go back and forth and have a set of wines in front of you. Tasting wine, even for me, tasting one wine in isolation, I can get my head around it much less clearly than if I have other wines to compare and contrast it to. Additionally, if you want to do a little experiment, we haven't had the question yet, but it's very common to get an experience about, or a question about decanting. And decanting is something we do to wines for 2 different reasons. With very old wines, they develop a sediment in the bottle very commonly. And in that scenario, we decant the wine gently off of that sediment so that we don't get gunk in our glass. But with a very young wine, it also could be extremely helpful to decant the wine. However, the goal there is very different. When you are decanting a young wine, you are doing it to get air into the wine. And when you aerate the wine, it tends to open it up more quickly, reveal more of its flavors and aroma, and also round out the mouthfeel a little bit. It can take a little bit of time, but I can tell you the lazy winemaker's trick, which is mine, which I do. When there's a young wine and I know there's no sediment in it, if I want to aerate it, because quite frankly, I hate cleaning decanters, I literally pour out half a glass or a glass. And here, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see myself, because oh, you can actually see the bottle. Pour out a little bit. You can kind of see the bottle. Put the cork back in, and I just shake the crap out of it like that. So if you want to pour 1 glass, shake up your bottle and aerate a little bit, and then pour another glass. And even after we're done tonight, go back to those wines and see if you can tell a difference. My guess is, while it may be subtle over the course of an hour or 2, you'll notice a difference. And that will help you to start to learn about when a wine, maybe you open a wine and you're like, wow, I'm just not getting much out of it. It's really tight and it's coarse. Oh, maybe it needs some air. So doing those little experiments help you to learn when a wine might benefit from a little bit of aeration. So diving into the Sonoma County Cab, I already mentioned it's our most broadly distributed, and is really a style that I intend to showcase the fresh, juicy character of Cabernet Sauvignon. And the winemaking goes along with that. This wine is, on average, most vintages comes from 2 vineyards, one in Alexander Valley that I mentioned, Borelli Creek was on our map, and another called Fry Ranch, which is in Dry Creek Valley. Very close as the crow flies, but in different valleys. So, and importantly, different aspects, meaning the vineyard tilts a different direction, which means the sunshine hits the berries at different times of day, which has a different effect. But grown ourselves on those 2 ranches, that is typically 80% of the blend of this wine. But again, what I'm looking to do here is to capture the characteristics of Cabernet Sauvignon, which I would argue are dark fruit. That can be blackberry, maybe dark plum, or cassis, the mythical cassis. I don't know if people have had blackcurrant, but it's really a very classic descriptor for Cabernet. But it also has these herbal characteristics. But then in terms of mouthfeel, it's a very heavy-bodied wine. It has a lot of weight. It has presence in your mouth. And so I want to capture those things. But the other thing it has is a fair amount of tannin. And I mentioned that earlier. Tannin is what gives you that dryness or almost chewy coarseness in your mouth, almost like there's sandpaper sometimes. And so I want that weight, I want that fruit character, I want it to be recognizable as Cabernet, but I also want it to have a lot of drinkability. I don't want it to be too tannic and coarse, because while in the industry, we talk all the time about food and wine and how great that is, the reality is that a lot of wine drinkers these days, especially in the United States, will drink wine as a cocktail or drink it before a meal. And when you have a lot of tannin in the wine, that tends to build up and become very drying and unpleasant in your mouth. The food actually counteracts that tannin. And that's why wines that go with food nicely often have tannin and or acidity, because it's counterbalanced by the food. But I want this wine to be able to be enjoyed on its own. And so when we ferment this on the skins, which is how red wines are made, when we're extracting the color, the flavor, and those tannins that are basically building the structure of this wine, I tend to have the shortest extraction on this wine, meaning it spends the least amount of time on the skins, because I want to get that weight, that body, that flavor, but then I want to drain that wine off of the skins before it becomes really coarse and tannic. Now, I mentioned extraction, or what we would call maceration. That's when the juice and the skins are in contact. That is very much needs to be in balance from a winemaking perspective with the aging of the wine. So when we extract a wine with a lot of tannin, a lot of structure and muscle, we then need to age it a fair amount to help soften and round out that structure that we've built. With the Sonoma County Cabernet, since I am not extracting a lot of tannin, I can get away with aging it less. So this gets the least amount of age of these three wines. But in addition, almost none of this wine is aged in barrels. Now, barrels are porous. They're made of wood, and oxygen actually penetrates the staves, or the boards that barrel is made out of, and over time will help that wine soften. So I can get away with aging the Sonoma County in stainless steel because I don't need to do that softening. So you might beg the question, well, why don't you just age it in barrels and you can extract it more? Well, what I really want to do here is preserve that juicy primary fruit. And as you age wine in barrels, it's a very similar pattern to what we talked about when you age wine in bottle. You tend to develop more complexity. The fruit profile evolves from less vibrant, fresh, and primary to a more complex, almost dried fruit character. And so I don't want to age that in barrels because I really want to preserve that youthful fruit character. So with that, I'm going to taste it. See if I actually believe my own story. So I'm not sure what vintage people would have out there. I have all 17s here. But I think what you'll get is you get a hint of sweetness on the front palate right as it enters your mouth. And then you'll get a little bit of that dryness or tannin on the finish, but it's relatively short and not super intense. And again, as we go to the other wines and you go back, I think you'll see that a bit more. Any questions on the Sonoma County Cab?
We do have a question regarding the barrels and what types of barrels you guys use in-house.
So I'll get to that when we talk about the wines that are aged in barrel. I actually do use oak for the Sonoma County Cab. With oak, there are a couple of ways we can provide oak flavor. So when you have a traditional barrel, you put the wine in the barrel, and I mentioned that you have this effect of oxygen, but when a barrel is newer, it also has flavor compounds in the wood itself that are extracted, very much like a tea bag, but almost in reverse. And I'll talk about different oak flavors and aromas when we get to the other two wines. But in addition to doing that, we can actually take the staves or the boards that they would make a barrel out of, toast them separately, and then actually put them in the tank. And so by putting oak in a tank for the Sonoma County, I'm able to get some of that flavor contribution, which in this wine would be kind of the sweeter notes like lighter caramel, some vanilla, maybe a hint of coffee, that really help to elevate and accentuate the fruit profile of the wine, but I don't get that aging effect from the oxygen. So it's really an ideal technique for this style of wine.
Great.
Okay, should we move on?
Yeah, let's go for it.
So I'm gonna cut to a little bit of a chase here because the next two wines, the Alexander Valley and then the Napa Valley, in terms of how I craft them in the winery, they're made in a very, very similar fashion. So most of what you're tasting in the difference between those two wines is going to be driven by where those grapes are grown. But first, let me describe generally how the winemaking on these two wines works. Unlike the Sonoma County, I'm looking to build more structure and muscle in these wines. So they are going to ferment on the skins or macerate for a longer period of time. Whereas the Sonoma County may be 7 to 10 days, depends on the individual fermenter. The Alexander Valley and the Napa Valley are going to be closer to 14 to, call it, almost 20 days, but 2 weeks plus, call it. That builds a bigger structure. And you can think of it a lot like building a house, right? It's like framing a house. The maceration or extraction period on a red wine is one of the most critical periods there are when you're making that wine. Because just like when you frame up a house, there's a lot you can still do to make it look and feel different, but the structure is set, right? You have the rooms, you have the openings in the walls. You're not really going to change that. And it's the same with a red wine. You can tweak the style this way or that way with different techniques during aging and barrels. But once you drain that wine off of those skins, you have built the structure and dictated 80% of how that wine is going to taste. So we're building a lot of structure. And like I mentioned, that needs to be counterbalanced or offset to some degree by the barrel aging. So as opposed to the Sonoma County, which is aged in stainless steel for about 14 months, these two wines are aged for about 1.5 years exclusively in barrel. In addition, they are aged in a certain percentage of brand new barrels. And brand new barrels are going to contribute the most flavor and aroma impact because, again, it's like using a tea bag, right? If you make tea, that's pretty good. You get a new cup of water, use that same tea bag, it's going to be a little weaker. Third cup of water, it's going to be pretty darn weak. That's how a barrel works as well. And these wines are roughly a third, about 30% new oak, primarily French. French and American provide different flavor impacts, but they both have a little dollop of American oak in there as well. But one of the other things, there was the question about oak. The oak flavor exists on a spectrum as well, kind of like I mentioned for wine fruit flavors. We talked about unripe to dried or cooked. Well, oak gets toasted. The barrels get put over a fire and they get toasted. That is actually what develops the flavors. There's very little flavor in raw oak other than kind of a planky wood flavor. But as you start to toast that barrel, it will move through a spectrum of flavors depending upon how much you toast it. At first, you will get kind of vanilla or sweet notes. And interestingly enough, it is actually the compound vanillin, just spelled vanillin, but it's pronounced vanillin. It is the exact same compound that is in a vanilla bean. And that compound is produced through the toasting of the oak. As you toast it more, you'll get towards the darker sweet notes, so caramel. Then you'll move into actually roasted notes. So this would be, light chocolate, lightly roasted coffee, into darker roast coffee and dark chocolate. And ultimately, you'll get to charred or smoky characters. And so we work very closely with our coopers to dial in the toast level that we want to showcase in these wines. And so, with that, I think I'll taste the Alexander Valley. Yeah, so as opposed to the Sonoma County, in the Alex and the Napa, you're going to see slightly darker toast profiles, as opposed to those sweeter, kind of lighter caramel notes. You will definitely get some mocha, some coffee, those kind of things, which darken the impression of the fruit profile a little bit. But on the Alexander specifically, being that it is a slightly cooler region and the soils are a little more fertile, you have a couple of things. One, generally speaking, Alexander Valley tends to be what I would call a little more rustic. And what do I mean? That sounds cool, but what do I mean by that? Well, I would call it the opposite of refined. So the tannins in the Alexander Valley are going to be kind of chunky. They're going to have a real presence in your mouth. They're not going to seem, while the Napa Valley will have a fair amount of tannin, it's not going to be quite as blocky or chunky. So it's the difference between, say, a log cabin and a really nicely finished house. It's just more rustic. In addition, depends on vintage a little bit, but This wine will showcase more of this kind of sage leaf or fresh herb character, can be very predominant. So we're going to see more of that in a cool vintage. And, there's a question earlier about climate. I mentioned that you'll get more of these herbal characters in a cooler location. Well, you will also get more of them in a cooler vintage, right? Every year is a little bit different in terms of growing season. And so that's definitely a common characteristic that we see in the Alexander Valley. Any questions on the Alexander Valley specifically?
We actually have a question just in regards to the sweetness level. We have someone on Zoom that's curious which one would be the sweetest that you are sharing today. Would it be the Sonoma?
So I'm going to answer it two ways, because there is sweetest, meaning how much sugar is there, like literally how much sugar content does it have? And it would be the Sonoma County. There's actually not a lot of sugar in there, but there is a little bit that helps contribute to that kind of softening impression of the mouthfeel, making it more drinkable on its own. But then there's also sweetness perception. And the perception of sweetness in wine can be affected by a number of things. As you have higher acidity, the perception of sweetness goes down. Additionally, alcohol actually can have a sweet quality on the front of the palate. It's different than sugar, but in the very entry of the wine, higher alcohol wines often have the impression of sweetness, but the beauty about alcohol sweetness is that it doesn't have this kind of cloying, lingering quality. When you have very sweet wines, meaning a lot of sugar in them, they tend to kind of coat your mouth and be real heavy. Alcohol has this sweetness in the front of the palate that really dissipates nicely. So I would give the same answer for both questions, however. Sonoma County, both in perception and residual sugar, is the sweetest.
Awesome.
With that, I think we can move to the Napa Valley. So the Napa Valley Cab is, again, made very similarly to the Alexander Valley. And so much of what you see is influenced by where the grapes are grown. When I was showing the map, I showed you the vineyards that form the backbone of this wine, and they're up at elevation in the mountains. And this is something that we had, I mentioned inspiration from our history. While this wine is not attempting to duplicate anything we've ever made in our past, Louis P. Martini actually for a number of years made something called California Mountain Cabernet. And the family has always had a real attraction to mountain vineyards. Monte Rosso is a mountain vineyard. Stagecoach is a mountain vineyard. And so it is quite fitting in terms of tie to history that the backbone of this wine is made from vineyards that are up at elevation. As you move up into elevation, you tend to build more body and structure. You have lighter crops, smaller berries, less vine growth, which allows you to get very ripe, concentrated wines. Those, because we're getting so much flavor, aroma, mouthfeel from the skins of the grapes, the smaller the berries, the greater the ratio of skin to juice. And so you tend to build these more concentrated wines. And let's taste it. If you haven't tasted it, please taste it, because I want you to taste it before I make a couple more comments. And as is one of the reasons that Napa Valley is known for Cabernet Sauvignon, is that it produces, in general, this kind of wine. You will find that it has, I believe, the richness in the body of the Alexander Valley, but with more polish and refinement to it. It's a little bit more seamless and refined. Clearly there's tannin in there, there's some dryness, but it's not that rustic, blocky quality of the Alexander Valley. And when I pour these two wines for groups, it is often split almost dead down the middle, who prefers which one. It's just different styles for different people. But you'll mention, or you might remember, in fact, if somebody wants to comment, does anybody remember what I said was the most important variable to wine style? I'm gonna wait for it because there's type of grape. Nice, you guys are good. You are so attentive. I'm impressed. It's the grape variety.